I'm Angela Kelly Robeck, host of the Empowered Principal Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Teaching While Queer is a podcast for 2S LGBTQ+ educational professionals to share their experiences in academia. Hi, I'm your host, Brian Stanton, a theater pedagogue and educator in New York City, and my goal is to share stories from around the world from 2S LGBTQ+ educators. I hope you enjoy Teaching While Queer. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Teaching While Queer. Today, I am joined by Max Whitehouse. Hi, Max. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm great. Thank you. How are you?
I am well, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who you are, what do you do, how you identify within the community?
Yeah, well, my name, like you said, Max Whitehouse. I am the principal of a small alternative school, and I identify as a trans man. I've been in school administration for 5 years now. Started out as a paraeducator, actually, in the school that I am now the principal of, which is really fun to see the full circle.
It's really fun.
Yeah, and I taught in alternative high schools and did credit recovery, GED prep most of my teaching career. I also taught middle school math for a few years, and really enjoying my job as the principal.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So you said alternative school. Can you tell me a little bit, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, and I'm going to be a little bit vague just because I want to protect the privacy of my students.
Absolutely.
I'm choosing to not even say where I live just because I want to make sure that they are protected, because my students are all in treatment facilities. So we partner with treatment agencies in our city and provide education for kids while they're accessing treatment. So it's a K-12 school. We have multiple campuses, and so it's alternative in the sense that, you know, we partner with the treatment programs to make sure that the kids are getting what they need in their social emotional learning and their mental health needs, but we try to also keep them moving forward in their school life and keeping them at least striving towards grade level while they're in this really different setting. That's awesome.
Yeah. That's really cool that your community has that kind of resource available.
Yeah, it's really amazing. It's really rewarding work. It's really challenging work. We get a lot of calls from schools all over the region and in other states saying, how can I get this kiddo into your school? Unfortunately, this is a therapeutic placement, so, you know, it has to go through like either the Department of Human Services or correctional facilities or for insurance placement purposes. But you know, and I tell my team and I tell other people that the kids that we support, they're not unlike kids in other schools and other school districts. A lot of kids right now are struggling with mental health needs. And so the big difference is that our kids are actually getting the support and the services that they need. Then the residential programs, they get regular meals a day. They have a safe place to sleep. They're getting potential medication that's supporting their needs. And so we actually, we're pretty lucky that we get to know kids in this way. And while they're in pretty traumatic situations, it's really rewarding work.
That's wonderful. Honestly, you hit the nail right on the head when you said that, like, there are kids all over, really all around the world who need something like this program, and your students are actually getting the treatment that they need, and also like a caring educational environment, which is just really fantastic. So kudos, like, fantastic work. I love that. And we'll dive more into that, you know, as we go along in our conversation. But I'd love to take a journey back in time and have you talk a little bit about what it was like for you growing up as a queer youth.
Well, I'm of the generation that it wasn't quite as accepting as it is now. I mean, in where I live, at least, we have a lot of kiddos who are open about their gender identity, and their gender expression is really varies sometimes from day to day. When I was a kid, it wasn't really a possibility. There was not a whole lot of language for being trans. It was mostly just really negative stuff. So I didn't really have a sense of my identity or who I was. I didn't identify as a queer youth. I did struggle with maintaining friendships. I was socialized as a female, and I was expected to have friends who were girls, and I kind of flitted in and out of friend groups most of my childhood because I just didn't feel like I fit. And so I didn't know that could have to do with my identity and my, I internalized that a lot around like who I am as a social being. And so it wasn't until I got to college and was able to recognize that I was, attracted to women, that felt a little bit better. I felt like I could be a little bit more myself then. And I figured if I identify and I present myself more butch, it's more acceptable because I am presenting as a lesbian. So that felt good for a little bit, so it wasn't until I was in my late 30s that I even was able to be comfortable talking about my gender identity. So just in terms of my childhood, I didn't really feel like I fit in, but I didn't understand why.
That's fair. I think there's definitely a period of time, not so long ago, where there just weren't the words. And I feel that as an adult, that when I was younger, there were no words, and it also, all of it had a negative connotation. So what words did exist were not presented in a very wonderful light. It made you not want that,
That's right. And I think there are a lot of trans people who at a very young age recognize, wow, like you're telling me I'm a girl or I'm a boy, but I'm not. And I wasn't that way. I just didn't really feel like I fit in a lot of ways. And without the language around me, then it was really hard for me to create that identity of my own. So I think it's helpful for young people to know that you don't have to know when you're 4 that you're trans. It's just what feels right, and how do you connect with your body and your identity, and it's at your own time.
Yeah, what I really love about being able to have these conversations with people is that in a previous episode, I talked with someone who transitioned really late in life. She transitioned in her 60s. So it was like, there's no perfect time. There's no perfect equation. Like, you always have the ability to become who you're meant to be. It's not about fitting a specific timeline or the expectational timeline. And I think that also, there's a lot of that wrapped around in queer theory, right? About how our timelines for life are a little bit skewed compared to what a heterosexual cisgender person might experience, because we don't get that euphoria of being ourselves and discovering ourselves until it happens. So I'm really pleased for those kids today who are able to identify this young in life, because it puts them more on a typical route for life. But for many of us who made some of these discoveries either as teenagers or as an adult, it really does shift your own maturity timeline, because you have to reassess who you are in this new knowledge and how your identity fits within the timeline you had and what you want to do. So it's a really interesting it's a very interesting time to live in, because it is like the in between between being the ideal situation where someone can be very, very young and know, you're saying I'm a girl, but I'm a boy, to still having people transitioning it well into their 60s and sometimes 70s. And so we've got this like in between realm that just seems so intriguing. Like, I'm a researcher, so I love, these kind of things.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, there is no turmoil centered around like your gender identity. It's just like who you are, and we're erasing those gender expectations and those gender norms without erasing like the beauty of femininity or the beauty of masculinity, but that we can just be. that would be great if that's where we could end up someday as a society.
You heard it here, folks. We're putting it out into the universe. It would be fantastic if that's where we can end up as a society, that this is just a part of who you are. And I think that's the most frustrating part for me, is that, like, I will have family members, I will have people I don't even know being like, why is this your whole identity? And I'm like, it's really not. Like, I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I'm a singer, I love swimming, and I do all of these things, and also I'm gay. However, I also, have a podcast that's geared toward queer people. So it's like, it is a part of my identity that I hold dear and that I want to express because I feel that it's important, but it's not 100% who I am. Like, I am not, I may be queer 100% of the time, but like, I could walk down the street and, with the exception of always having outrageous hair colors, like, you might not know. Yeah. I'm just a person. I'm a human.
Right. And I get a lot of questions like that too, especially from family members. It's, as a trans person, you think like the whole point is to pass, for me to pass as a male. And it's great. It feels really good. And I love that. And I want to be able to be seen as who I am. But I also am really proud of my identity as a trans person. And I feel like, especially as an educator, it's essential that I'm open about my identity. And so it's like this kind of a weird line. I don't want to live in a community where it's not safe for me to be trans. At the same time, it's really nice for some people, every once in a while, for people to not know that just doesn't become who I am for everybody, but I'm just me. It is an interesting place to live.
Absolutely. I actually once had a student that wasn't even like my student. It was during the isolation period of the pandemic, and that student was homeschooling at the time and had to come in for standardized testing because it was a requirement where I was. And they had such a visceral reaction to their dead name being on the roster when they checked in with me, like, at the front, because their whole goal was, I transferred to a new school, we moved to a new place just so I can be who I am without people having to know. Mm-hmm. And then what was really beautiful is I helped the student out. I even walked them to their room and changed their name so that nobody could see their dead name anymore. And then instituted a policy at the school where they had to check it. Like, I worked with the counselors. But what was really beautiful for me is that once they were on campus consistently, they became more comfortable with their trans identity because they had community. And so you're absolutely correct. In some moments, you're just like, I'm passing and this is fantastic. And this is really actually safe, likely. And then other moments where you're like, oh, hold up, I just want to be clear here that this is who I am. I'm a trans person, and I want you to know because it's important for me to tell you. And so I think it's such an interesting kind of journey. I read an interesting play this summer for a queer theater class, and it was written by a trans man, a one-person play. And he has a monologue in there that's from his girlfriend right after transition. And she talks about how they were lesbians, and she was cool that he was a butch lesbian. And now she feels like she has to tell people that he's trans so that she can keep her queer identity. And it's so interesting just how the interplay of identity and like openness or interconnectedness of the identities that I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that. I just find it really fascinating.
It is really hard. And like none of us want to have a label, but also our identity is important to us. Like, who we are is important to us. So it's hard to avoid the labeling.
Yeah, it's funny because I hear a lot of that, like, we don't want to be labeled, we don't want to be counted, like they're gonna put a serial number on us, or there's this like fear of things. And I'm one of the people who's like, but we need the data. We need to know how many queer people are here. We need to know this, and that. That's how we're going to get more rights, is if they realize that we're a big number and that we're not going away. And it's like a catch-22, because you don't want the label and you also want the privacy. But at the same time, you kind of need to be counted in order for greater society to care, which is really unfortunate, because we should be able to care about people for the sake of caring about people. But that's really not where we are as a society right now.
Right. And then it also, it doesn't take into account the fact that other marginalized folks, people of color, they don't get to decide. Like the rest of the world decides how to label them because of their appearance. It is hard to hide behind race. So, we are lucky that we can go into a community and be stealth and not have to be pointed out as this other. So it's that privilege of it, and it's been really hard to reconcile that the privilege that I've gained as a male and in the spaces, especially as the supervisor, the boss. I do have privilege. It was fascinating how easy it was to shit. Like people actually listened to me and my opinions and the things I thought as a man, as opposed to when I was presenting and living my life as a woman. And it's really like if you think about data and like the human condition, this social experiment of being trans is really, really fascinating, because I lived in this world until I was 36 as a woman. And cool club, of being with men and being able to hear the conversations that happen when it's just men, or the people believing me or listening to giving me any say in the matter. It's just it's just really unfortunate. It goes back to just what I was saying earlier about how if we could just eliminate those gender norms and the gender and what the expectations are without eliminating the beauty of our masculinity and femininity, that would just make things so much easier for all people involved. I think.
Absolutely. I mentioned before our interview that I'm taking a graduate course in gender and communication. Mm-hmm. And so this week we're literally dissecting male activist groups that are all about it's masculinity, masculinist, or not. What is the right word? They're not feminist. They are here for the man. And it's been so interesting to me, because there are certain there are a number of groups out there, and they do so many different things, and they approach it from different perspectives. And there's some groups that are, working towards almost restorative justice with how men interact with other genders in society and whatnot. And so they're approaching it from what could be labeled as a feminist perspective. Mm-hmm. And then there are groups that are like, feminism has absolutely ruined the man, and we need to go back to the man being the man, and it's all toxic masculinity. And so it's just so interesting that masculine and feminine can be such a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. If people just got out of the way of it. Mm-hmm. And didn't have to have an ideal of what that looks like and this kind of cookie cutter that they expect everybody to follow.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
So how do you see your experiences as a queer youth, as a person who transitioned in your 30s? How does that show up for you now as an administrator when it comes to working with students?
Well, it's interesting and unfortunate that a lot of the kids that I work with identify as queer, LGBTQ plus, specifically trans and non-binary. And it definitely puts a spotlight on the mental health challenges of being a queer youth in the work that I do. And so I think for me, one of the most important parts of my job as a trans administrator is that I can be visible for kids and that I can show up and make sure that they see that it's possible to to actually live alone. And queer staff and other educators feel like my school is a safe school to work at, and that's really important to me. It's important to the future of the queer community, and I think that one of the difficult parts about being a young person is that your parents have a lot of control over you and what you do in life. And so when your parents aren't supportive and affirming of you and your identity, it's really, really hard to feel like you can go on. And so finding out that other adults exist in the world that have survived the childhood of being queer and are now successful adults, I think is just really important. So that's what I think, just for me, especially in a large school district, always pushing the other administrators to do the right thing for their students, offering it's not my job to help answer questions and to help educate people about the trans experience, but I'm open to it and I'm happy to do it, because I think for me the most important thing to move our collective viewpoints and beliefs around being in the LGBTQ plus community, especially around gender identity. And one of the hardest ones I see it for educators is non-binary folks, and being able to acknowledge and represent, affirm the identity of a non-binary person. It's only going to happen if people have some humanity behind it. And so if I show up as a person to say, like, I'm open to helping you practice using they, them pronouns for a single person, I'm here to help you build those tools. And I'm open to answering any questions that I might know the answer to, or giving you the right resources so that you can learn. And I'm not afraid to be that person, the queer person that somebody knows, to just answer those questions. Because we have to do it one person at a time. I don't think it's going to collectively happen in this society right now. So, I just think my identity is just, the visibility of it is the most important thing to me. I continue to do my job. I continue to show up for all kids, really trying to recognize the power of my identity is really important for the future of our kids.
That's awesome. And I think what really struck me is like your focus on non-binary students, because it's a relatively new realm, I would say. Like, we have documentation of trans people existing for a long period of time. I shared something earlier today that I just love, which is like a turn of the century American trans man, in a suit. And I just thought it was so beautiful. And what gets me is that, like, non-binary is it's a newer concept, and it's so much harder for young people to identify it. I actually had a conversation with someone recently, and she said that, like, she felt that her daughter was exploring the idea of transitioning to male with a group of her girlfriends at school. And it was like a group of people thinking about that. And when she explained to her daughter that there's this space in between where you don't have to identify as male and you don't have to identify as female, you can just embrace your masculine and your feminine as you go. And her daughter just like had this eye-opening moment of like, oh, well, that makes sense, because I do like wearing dresses sometimes, but also I love having a short haircut and all these things that are archetypally male or female, masculine or feminine. And she's kind of got a blend of it. And most young people don't know that you don't have to choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And once one kid at the school starts to say, I use they, them pronouns, or I'm not a boy or a girl, then it'll catch on like wildfire. I've seen it happen. And I really do. I feel like non-binary identities are definitely becoming more and more prevalent. I mean, I live in a pretty liberal city, so I have more access to it, but I think it's one of the most misunderstood identities for an older generation of people. But I also love seeing so many kids just embrace it. And it's I feel like it's the future, but I do think it is important to continue to make sure we're not like eliminating those femininity and masculine. Like we're not, we can be gender free. Like we can, you don't have to identify as male or female. Nothing has to be specifically male or female, but I do think it is important. And my wife tells me this all the time. She's so proud of her femininity and a piece of her that she would never want to get rid of. It doesn't have to necessarily be using the pronoun she, her, but it's about the way that she carries herself and views the world and how she presents herself. And so I don't want to ever eliminate those pieces, but I do think there's some, it's so freeing for anybody to say, oh yeah, I do want to, like you said, wear a dress, or I do sometimes want to wear a tie, or I do, I have these traits or whatever that just wouldn't fit into that box. So it's pretty amazing. And it also is, to go back to something I alluded to earlier, it is really challenging for some people to shift their pronoun usage. And I've been in some really frustrating conversations with people who just say, well, I'm old, I'm not going to change. Well, I get down really into the details of, okay, let's just practice it. Let's just read this picture book and change all the pronouns to they, them. Let's talk about everybody using they, them pronouns until you can get used to it, because we're not going to debate it. Like, you have to honor this child's identity. I think that's the hardest thing for older people to support young identities because it just doesn't make sense, and they don't have a connection to it. So
Yeah, and I think there's a level of like, we do this in everyday life, we just don't talk about it. For instance, I told a story about a student. I use they, them pronouns for the sake of protecting that student's identity, not because that's how they identify. Mm-hmm. So we do it for ambiguity sometimes, and like, that's the point. It is that this person lives in an ambiguous state of both masculine and feminine, and so we already kind of have this language for it. It just gets so wrapped up. And you said something that was really important that I want to point out, was that when it came to your wife's femininity, it's not about her pronoun use, it's about how she carries herself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important, because a lot of people right now are getting caught up on pronouns. Mm-hmm. And they are incredibly important. But what I'd love to instill in our non-binary and transgender youth is that it doesn't change who you are if someone misgenders you. It's frustrating, and it's something that person needs to work on. But you carry yourself just how you want to carry yourself, because that's the most important part. You be you. Mm-hmm. And it's so easy to be angry all the time because all of these microaggressions, that's such a weird word, but microaggressions are happening, right? Of like being misgendered, and something, someone gives you something that's more feminine when you are a more masculine person. It's so easy to be angry. Mm-hmm. But we can also step back and just say, like, that's on them. And I'm still the great, amazing human being that I am.
That's right. And I do want to say, like, I don't want to make it sound like I think all people who are of a generation older than mine are this way and struggle with it, because it's certainly not the case. I just rarely have folks who are like my age or younger who push back as much. I think it's just a generational thing, and that's okay. So anyway, I just want to say I wasn't like overgeneralizing.
Fair enough. We love disclaimers. Disclaimers. Have you ever had to deal with a situation of anti-queerness in the school setting?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try to tell a bit of a story without giving away too much, just to protect the privacy of folks. But I did have an experience in which another administrator, with the permission of a member of the LGBTQ community, developed an incentive with kids like an attendance incentive, where if they hadn't reached a certain percentage or whatever over a certain amount of time, that he, a cisgendered straight white male, would go to a grocery store dressed as a woman. and and I heard about it, and I was early on in my admin career, and I wasn't going to rock boats by pushing back because I just didn't know who I could talk to about it. But then a couple years later, at a PD, actually during like the shutdown, somebody mentioned it as this was a great incentive that so and so did, and everybody else in the room was like, "Oh wow, that's so cool! That was so brave of you to do that." And I couldn't. I could in that moment. I was just floored that it was coming up again. But I
in
also,
a positive light, like in a positive light.
Yeah, right. Like, this is great. This is funny. How brave of you to do that. And I just didn't have words. In the moment to speak up about it, but I was clearly uncomfortable. Folks said that they could tell later, but what I did do is reach out to my supervisors who were facilitating that training, and I just shared with them, like, we can't trivialize people's identities in that way. Celebrating somebody for dressing up as a woman or of the gender that's not theirs, and how brave that is when they can just very easily take that makeup off and go about their life. And it also, and the challenging thing was that, a member of the community, a queer woman, was like, "Oh, that's really funny. That's a great idea." And so it just spoke to me to just the deep-seated, phobias that we have, and the internalized phobias that we have, and just like how we there's just a lack of education of what it means to really celebrate and respect a trans identity. And also, the kids thought it was funny. And so that's just, we just have to educate ourselves. So I did speak up, and I actually got a really good response. I was able to talk to that person who I fully respect as a really great human, and a really good administrator, but and he just didn't know. He didn't know that was going to be so hurtful. And so anyway, it was great. We had a restorative circle as a team, but the hardest part was that people came up to me later and said, "Yeah, I could tell that was really hard, but I didn't speak up in that moment." And so I think it just reminded me that we have to be allies. Even if we don't know what to say, we can say, "Look, this doesn't feel good." And it shouldn't fall on me to be the only one that brings it up as the trans person in the room.
Yeah, there's something about bystander syndrome or whatever it's called, where like people just will stand by and watch something happening and not say anything. And I just think that, especially in an educational space, we are all so close with our colleagues and whatnot, and we are working closely together. If you can visibly tell that someone's uncomfortable, then it shouldn't be that person's responsibility to say something. And so the fact that you got all these comments afterwards is a little bit disheartening, because it's like, what were you waiting for?
Yeah. And I maybe to a fault, I'm just really patient, because I feel like, I don't know if I'm sure you watched the documentary. I think it's Undisclosed. That was called the
Disclosure.
Disclosure. Thank you. That it really opened up my eyes to all of the, like, when I was a kid, I loved the movie Ace Ventura, and I thought it was amazing. I thought it was the funniest thing, and I loved it. I watched it over and over again, and I never realized just how awful it is in terms of the way that they represent the trans identities in that movie. And so even myself as a queer person, have those instances where I don't realize, wow, that's really harmful. And so it's just about continuing to communicate and talk to each other and ask the hard questions, and be okay with realizing, wow, I did something wrong there, and I caused harm, and I want to go back and fix it. Because this person, he didn't know. He had no idea. He was doing something that the kids asked him to do, and he got permission from somebody who also felt like, wow, that's pretty funny, let's do it. And so it's just about, like, repairing the harm, recognizing when you are doing something that you might not understand. how it's going to impact others. And he and I had a really wonderful conversation and continued to work together and have a great relationship after that. So it was great. And I was really lucky to have supervisors who responded in that way, and to have colleagues that were supportive. I think that's also the thing about education, at least on the West Coast, and probably in like certain states in New England. Most educators are fairly liberal, and we're in the business of children and helping children thrive, and helping them have, successful, positive futures. And so for the most part, I'm surrounded by pretty liberal people that respect my identity, even if they don't understand it. So I guess I'm pretty lucky in that way.
Absolutely. When I first moved to Texas a while back, I live in New York now, but when I first moved to Texas, I had introduced myself to the other theater teachers in my district, because we would be working together creating, curriculum that goes all the way through the age groups. And one of my friends had introduced herself and said she was relatively conservative. And then when we get to know each other, she started evaluating what that means, and realized that like both of us probably fall into the middle realm. Though I am way more liberal than she is, she finds herself she's in the middle realm of and that's what conservatism used to be. So it's interesting because even some of the teachers that I know that like believe that they were very conservative, you're right in that many of the teachers are more on the liberal side, or liberal side enough to not worry about it, to let you do you and let you live your life and not get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I've met many educators who are pretty conservative, who, Trump supporters, very conservative families, and yet they still have so much compassion for kids and our future. And, so it's like, it's another one of those areas in life that's not black and white. You can have certain beliefs and values that don't necessarily align, but you can still we still have like humanity, and we're still responsible as educators to make sure that the children we work with grow up to be successful and kind, loving people.
Yeah. As a non-binary person, I'm definitely there for like, we don't need binaries in general. It doesn't have to be black and white all the time. That there is this kind of like spectrum of what you can be in between, whether it's the political spectrum or, watching a movie or having a visceral reaction to something. It's not, well, this is what it was intended. It's like there are things in between, and we have to remember it. I'm studying this right now for class, right? But Bell Hooks says that we need to be an engaged witness when we are consuming media, right? And that really means critical thinking. Like, not only do I see what's happening, but I'm feeling some sort of response to that, and I need to understand why I'm feeling that response. Mm-hmm. And so I think that so much of life is about in between, as opposed to where we think that like it has to be this or that, right or wrong. And there's no kind of wiggle room in there. And I just want to like shake people and be like, there's space. There's so much space for other things.
So true. Yeah.
So as an administrator, what advice would you give to someone who's coming into education for their very first year? They're a queer person and they're not sure about how to be their authentic self, either in the classroom or in the school building.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because most important is, folks do what they're comfortable with. You have to do what feels safe and appropriate for you. I think everybody has their own experiences and their own histories that might make it, that drive their desire to either be stealth or open about their identities. And so I think that's the most important factor, is what do you feel comfortable with? But I also just feel like, kids are really astute. And I know for my personal self, when I was not open and honest about my identity, when I was not fully embracing who I am, I was not fully present. There were things about me that, I had a really hard time with, and it was really hard to have authentic relationships with people because I was, I guess, essentially not having an authentic relationship with myself. And so kids can see when you're holding back, and when there's a part of you that you're not sharing or open about. That's to say, like, if you feel like you want to have those open, strong relationships with kids, and you feel like it's a safe community for you to be open about your identity, I would say, um, embrace it. Relationship. But again, it's tricky because I'm not here to tell somebody what to do or how to be. But I think that if you feel like you have allies, even if it's just maybe there's just a couple colleagues. When I was coming out, when I was starting to medically transition, I was teaching sixth grade math at the time, and it was like the middle of the school year, and I had a couple teachers that I always ate lunch with that I felt really comfortable with, and I started talking to them about my identity and how I changed my name, and I was thinking about doing it at school during the school year. And so they helped me because every time I would see them, they would just affirm my identity. So just that little bit of one or two people find the courage to then say, you know what, I'm kind of tired of being misgendered by all my students, and I'd like them to know who I truly am, and my body's gonna start changing a little bit more drastically. So I just need to have this conversation. So start small. If that's the most important, comfortable way to do it, then just listen to your body and listen to your heart and what feels right. Yeah, that's my advice. Find an ally.
I love that. And then, how do you think that school communities can make schools safer for 2S LGBTQ plus students?
I think that it's got to come from the very top. I mean, we have to have policies that support and protect kids of all identities, but we have to have school-wide, district-wide, statewide policies that really drive the decision-making around how to support kids and how to respond to hate. And how to respond to any sort of oppressive thing, because you might have a district-wide policy, but the principal at this specific school isn't super inclusive, and so there's going to be things that come up. But if there's a policy that is supported and pushed forward by like the superintendent or the Department of Ed person, wherever, then I think that's where it has to start. And unfortunately, that's not always going to be the reality. But we do, if we can think about ways to create more inclusive environments and communities for kids, from, all gender restrooms, policies around dressing down for PE or not. Being able to change your pronouns in the database. How can you, even if your parents don't support a different pronoun for you, how can you make sure that the teachers do? And that it doesn't get back to the parents if it's not safe for it to get back to the parents. So all those things really need to be considered from a policy level, I think. The other thing that is really important in my mind in terms of supporting our LGBTQ plus kids is supporting the adults and the staff who are also part of the queer community, because without that, it's going to be really hard to push forward any of those policies.
I can tell you, when you don't have the support, just from my own experience, burnout comes quicker.
Exactly.
I think I said somewhere in season 1, like, I would love to see a study of burnout between queer people and non-queer people, and just see, or even like any kind of minority versus heterosexual cisgender people.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes there's more responsibility, whether subconsciously or consciously, put on those people to protect the students as well as themselves.
It's true, and we hear a lot of that from educators of color, and the constantly navigating the not so microaggressions, and constantly having to feel like you have to perform a certain way so that you're not seen as that person, And it's true for all identities that are not like cisgenders, heterosexual, and it's really unfortunate that it can be so hard. And it, the other thing, though, if we can have, if they're, so that's why I think it's so important to support the adults, because then they can show up fully for kids. And then beautiful things happen. Like I met somebody at a conference a few years ago who teaches in, I think, Colorado, who created this like biology curriculum that is fully embraces the gender spectrum and gender identity, and all the different animals one way, aren't in a binary system, but also just changing the language that you talk when you talk about traits being passed down. The changing the language about the male or female pieces of biology. I'm not a biologist, so I'm really messing that up, but I think that that's the kind of stuff that can really be exciting, is that we really are embracing this whole world. And we were talking earlier about how non-binary identities in the United States, at least, are really new. I mean, there's 8 cultures all over the world that have a third gender. Maybe it's not non-binary, but there's a third gender that is recognized by cultures everywhere, and ancient cultures, indigenous cultures. So, we have to separate ourselves from the whiteness of the things that we believe and do, and just recognize that this isn't the only way to live in the world.
Yes, absolutely. Something you said really struck me, and it just disappeared, so that's unfortunate. But I wanted to give you the opportunity now to ask me a question. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we just met. I don't know a whole lot about you, but I have really enjoyed this conversation. I am really interested in your graduate program and like what you plan on doing with this, the master's degree. Is it that you're earning? And what was it, gender?
So my master's is in, it's a Master's of Fine Arts in Theater Pedagogy.
Oh, okay.
However, I am working on a course in communication and gender as part of a certificate that kind of is mushed together with my master's in culturally responsive pedagogies and universal design for learning. My goal is to create theater curriculum that is accessible for everyone, regardless of ability or disability, regardless of gender and gender expression, regardless of race. There is so much in the theater world that is cisgender, white, male dominated that like I start getting teary-eyed when I read a play that has a non-binary character or a trans character in it. I saw And Juliet on Broadway a while back, and there's a non-binary character, and they did this crazy thing because it's a pop musical. They did this beautiful thing where that character is saying, I'm not a girl, yet not yet a woman. And it was so interesting to see a non-binary character that was, the world doesn't see me as a girl and I'm not yet the woman that I'm going to be, was just kind of like really powerful. And there are currently on Broadway 3 shows that feature non-binary characters, and they're really wonderful. I've seen 2 out of the 3 of them. And so I just want to see kind of more of that happening, but I'm an educator and a researcher, and I love that kind of work. And so my goal is to develop curriculum that I can then go into a collegiate program to teach future teachers how to create an inclusive classroom that really focuses on everybody. And that includes, how do we subconsciously communicate with different genders differently? And how do we communicate the same? This course is not, the course I'm taking right now is not a binary. It's not like, it's not men are from Mars and women are from Venus or whatever. It's like, here's the gender spectrum that we know of now. We have male, female, gender queer, non-binary, transgender, all of these people on a spectrum. How do we communicate with them effectively? How do they communicate, and how does society communicate to them in general? So like, I'll be I'm going to be doing a project that's basically critiquing advertisements, and I'm going after all the crappy game advertisements that come across my iPhone, because there are so many misogynistic games.
Yeah, like,
and I'm sitting here going like, I'm so happy that I have like these restrictions on my kids' phones, because I would not want them to watch this advertisement where this woman has to completely change herself and the man still leaves her for this beautiful other woman. And I'm like,
And then the house
what
burns
is this
down or whatever.
advertisement like? And
Yeah.
it's really just about like playing cards. Like, what is happening here, and why is that even necessary? What is the story that we're telling people? I did a whole talk in a queer theater class about like the idea of indoctrination, right? And looking at even just toddler and infant clothing, and how much gendered clothing there is, and how much targeted sexual gender clothing there is.
Yes.
Like daddy's accident, and like mama's stud, or whatever, or like,
yeah, like sexualizing infants
yes,
is never okay. Yeah, I know. I have an almost 2-year-old, and we've done our best to have a variety of different clothing, but it's like every store has the clothes separated by gender.
yep.
And
It's funny because my son is shorter. He has shorter legs, and so for a while we were just like, I know it says male and female, just go to the women's section and get the pants that fit you, because they fit you.
Yeah, it's about the body. Yeah, and it's fascinating the way you're talking about this course you're taking, because so much about how we communicate with other genders is based on the social expectations of those genders, right? And so if we can just eliminate those expectations that we have, yeah, I mean, it's not easy. I say just, but it sounds like a really great course, and it sounds like an amazing goal to create some inclusive classrooms, especially in the theater. I love that.
Yeah, I just feel like it's an environment where we keep tooting this horn that we're so inclusive, and I don't think that people have the resources to truly follow through with that. And what I've noticed as an educator is that theater tends to be the catch-all for students who don't want to choose an elective for their fine arts credit, especially in a high school setting. And so you get a ton of students who have ADHD, or might have dyslexia, and all of these things that, like, here I am telling you to read this script out loud right now. And maybe students, and pretty consistently, my students have severe anxiety, which is wild because some of them have chosen to like be an actor. Right. And so for those of them who don't, like, I have all of this wonderful backstage curriculum on how you don't have to deal with that. But for those of them where we have some sort of performance requirement, it's like, how do you work with this stuff? And I see this question all the time on groups, like, how do you work with students who have so much anxiety that they can't do the work? And that's the stuff that I kind of want to answer. I also think that like the open source fonts that are out there need to be more utilized in school settings, for especially for dyslexic students, because if we're trying to hold students accountable for reading scores, then they need to be able to read it. And if there are resources we can provide them that are free, why are we not using them?
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that are like going through my brain, and it really is universal. It's not solely on theater. It's just that happens to be what I teach and what I love. But some of the stuff that I'm working on, it's like, I can take this and apply it to a math class right now. We just need to figure out how to present things in a more inclusive manner, so that everybody feels comfortable. And then if they feel comfortable, they're going to do the work.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, so many of my students have disabilities, or and have like an IEP, or they have never been labeled, or given any sort of support because of their disability. And so, yeah, we have to be able to create conditions in which everybody can learn, because we far too often don't have high expectations for the people that need just as high expectations, because we're all capable. So I love that, thinking about how to shift how to shift what we provide and how we access the learning. I never
Absolutely.
even considered that, like the script. If you're wanting to be in a play, you still have to read the script.
Yeah.
Yeah, just something as basic as that. Like,
and if you struggle with reading, that's going to be hard. And I can give you a calendar, and that calendar might not work for you. You know, some students don't do well with calendars and checklists. Like, you have to figure out what works with the student. And I feel like the more universal that we are, the more we're going to catch students who are very good at masking their weaknesses. And so we might catch a student who's like a C student starting to excel because they were able to mask enough to not need an IEP, but they kind of needed the resources. Right. They just were either stigmatized or they were barely passing whatever tests that were, bringing them into the situation. And so I think that the more universal we can be, the more education will actually work for everybody. And once the resources are created, it doesn't take a ton of extra time. So it's really just, we need more curriculum writers who are able to come in, who, one, have experience teaching. It is a must. And two, who are willing to like take your year at a glance and be like, great, here are the resources I can give you that are going to help make this universal for your students. And so that's kind of the work that I'm doing. This year, I'm actually writing like a technical theater curriculum for high school that is universally designed. So it's going to have units in set and lights and sound and costume and makeup and all the things, but it's going to have tasks that can be done in a variety of ways. It's going to have choice assignments. It's going to have readings that can be done using open source fonts. So that way we can really try to hit as many students as possible. Because my goal is not to eliminate the IEP needs. My goal is to try to address them up front. So that way I'm not doing the extra work of having to then, I've written my curriculum and now I have to write another one for this student specifically.
Right.
I write the curriculum universally designed for everybody to be able to achieve success. And then I have one-off things that I need to hit with different students. Whether that's having to read the questions out loud for them or read the answers to them or whatever the situation that pops up from their IEP, it's a lot less work if we just create a better plan to start.
Yeah, I agree. And that we treat that IEP as a tool and not just a document that we have to follow or that we as a legal document. Yeah, I see far too often it's just, well, here's the thing. Did they meet their goal? Nope. Okay, let's add it again. It's like if this is something we have to put our energy into, like, let's make it useful.
I also think teachers get creative because you can look at those IEP goals, and if you teach a math class and they have a reading IEP goal, like, work that into your class. I had a whole class for 4 years that was a mix of 50% students with disability and 50% partners that worked with them to put on plays. And I looked at all of their IEP goals and I said, great, this is how we're going to work this into their session. So if they were a student who was non-speaking and they had a communication device and their goal was to learn how to use their communication device, I went to the speech language pathologist, had them program the lines into the communication device, and then they had to follow the pattern and learn to use their communicator. If I had a student who needed to focus on reading certain words or whatnot, they had a word list every week, I highlight those in their script. So that way they know that they're practicing. We're all contributing to the goal, because just because they have a math goal or a reading goal doesn't mean that the other classes can't impact that. The student is that the goal is hit.
Yeah. And you're speaking to just how important it is to have the arts in school, because that is a beautiful place and way to be able to help kids with their goals and learn how to read and write and do the math in a setting that's not just that traditional sit and get classroom. So it's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Max, I've really enjoyed our time today. I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. And thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Teaching While Queer. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. leave a review, and that would help out tremendously. You can also support the podcast by going to www.teachingwhilequeer.com and hit support the show. Thanks so much, and have a great day.